Hello, these are my notes for week 8. These notes will be slightly different from what I've done before. That's so I can try to keep on target with helping you get a firm grip on deconstruction. Rather than dealing with each individual reading, I'm going to pick out bits to try to put together a sense of the big picture for this lens. To begin with, our editors provide a pretty comprehensive overview of the historical development of deconstruction through post-structuralist theory. I know it's sometimes frustrating because our editors can be rather wordy and repetitive in their writing. If I had charge of Rivkin and Ryan, I would smack their knuckles for every time they use the phrase etc., and I'd do it twice for every time they use the abbreviation. However, despite their annoying habits, they do provide some good commentary and an excellent sense of context. For our purposes, I'm going to start with our repeated reading from Barth, Death of the Author. What we've been saying about deconstruction from the beginning is that it likes to complicate simple definitions. In fact, it's predicated on the idea that our way of thinking about ourselves and our world is riddled through with assumptions that we don't even know we're assuming. The purpose of deconstruction is to make us step back and look for those assumptions and see who or what benefits from our maintaining them as givens. So we start with example number 1, the concept of authorship. Many of you are creative writers, but even if you're not, I know you have composed many a paper in your academic career. I anticipate that you would like to think that your labor in doing so should equate with the recognition for yourself as the author of those works. Similarly, I am sure that all of you have a writer who you are partial to, whether it is Tolkien, Hemingway, McCullers, or Eliot. No other writer sits with you quite like that favorite one does. And in the tradition of Harold Bloom, when you write, you pattern your own ideal for writing after that specific person. Then Barth comes along and talks about what it means to be an author. He says, people are products of society, so no person can be said to be more than a conduit for what society has provided him or her to be. Barth goes beyond that by saying that the very concept of the author is simply a construct that we have come to attach to writing over a relatively short span of our history. Authorship, as we know it, is essentially about marketing, a way to group and classify works that are being sold. When we find an author we like, we buy that author's works. But in general, it's simply a way for us to identify books we are likely to want. This method of production is not found in previous models, where authorship was considered the end result of cooperative and communal effort. And there's just you think about how the works of Plato overtly name Socrates as the source of the wisdom that he conveys, so that he is pairing himself with his master. The point of the deconstructionist is that nothing is as simple as just naming it. When we read an author, we are hearing not just from a person, but all the people who influenced him or her, and indirectly, all the people that influenced them. We're hearing from people who set up systems of grammar, and from people who prioritized subject matter, like love, revenge, or death, as important enough to write about in the first place. We're hearing from long traditions that say these things should be written and should be read. And these are all cultural constructs that have been developed by people, not, the deconstructionists would say, because it's the great plan of who we are and what we do. And that brings me around to the second reading from Barth, From Work to Text. This time, the complication he sets up is a little easier to take, because it's not so much about tearing down an idea as building one up. Where Barth acts as iconoclast in Death of the Author, he's more of an iconograph here, asking us to consider inscribing even more significance into a concept than we already do. He turns from the author to what is produced through an author. Regardless of quality, regardless of subject, he wants us to invest the text as more than just a piece of writing. When you pick up 1984, Beloved, Brave New World, or The Handmaid's Tale, the book is not merely a collection of words between two covers. It is a collection of concepts contained, reference made, and foundational subtexts included, all radiating meaning in all directions, back through history and across culture. The text, in this sense, is not a static thing, but a vital amalgam. Barthes writes, "The text is experienced only in an activity." As I say, this expansion of an idea is probably one we can more easily get on board with because we can immediately think about our own experience when reading those things that have moved us and feel that what Barthes suggests rings true. However, he goes on to make the point that the uniqueness of any text in how it brings together a particular selection of stimulants functions because this uniqueness builds a boundary between what it is to be or what is to be had in one text versus what is to be had in any other. He writes, "It can only be text in its difference." And I'll use that word to segue to Derrida and his article of the same name. Derrida decided to look at things in a way no one else had, and he began by examining the way we tend to group things into binaries, and he came up with a fresh take on the idea of the binary by looking for meaning as existing in the median between the two poles. This might sound an awful lot like what we just went through with Hegel: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So what you will want to know is how what Derrida suggests is different from what Hegel or Marxist critics like Bakhtin did with Hegelian logic. Our editors, Rivkin and Ryan, address this at great length. The answer is that even though Hegel adopted a flexible way of addressing how we know, the categories for what we know were still governed by the same assumptions that had always been used in Western metaphysics. These include a primacy for presence, substance, and identity. Consider the Cartesian proposition, "I think, therefore I am." You see immediately that we have a confluence of all three ideas. Thinking is an activity grounding the individual in the moment and announcing presence. That presence equates to both a proof of existence, substance, and a descriptor of personhood, identity, as a thinker. The Hegelian dialectic works through expanding that presence into a flexible awareness of the subject, but it does not question the assumptions about what that presence is and what it might legitimately do. Our primary users of Hegel are Marxists. Remember, Marxists are strongly materialistic, so they're very attached to the substance as a given. They believe that truth resides in the reality of labor producing commodities. In this view, we are physically anchored to our world and ourselves. So that's where you can see how what Derrida offers is going to have a very different valence in regard to binaries than what the Marxist will produce when approaching the same binaries. What Derrida wants to suggest is that the common sense that informs us about connections of presence, substance, and identity is a way of thinking about what we are that is informed by an inherited tradition. It is, in short, just a way of thinking, not necessarily the truth. Look at the method in difference. The entire article attempts to hash out how we make meaning for a concept that has no material correlation. A table is a table, but a difference changes according to the materiality that we assign it. Derrida's argument seems set up to follow the Hegelian dialectic, where he begins with polarized meanings and connotations for a single word. However, because the word occupies a fluid space where it is in relation to multiple potential materials, its meaning is tied to the mediation of whatever we want it to be, whatever we decide it to be. Derrida contends that what we see happening with this abstract word is actually what happens with all words, but our focus Our tradition of simplifying things, making a direct connection between the material and meaning, makes us ignore this understanding. Western metaphysics has skewed us to always try to make connections through presence, substance, and identity. So there's a fundamental problem with our assumptions. Derrida directs us to develop a way of regarding our world that makes us question those assumptions first, as our primary and most productive method of inquiry. So we come to That Dangerous Supplement by Derrida. And I've saved it for last because I see it functioning primarily as an example of what Derrida is talking about. In it, he applies himself to a reading of various works by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the famous philosopher of the Enlightenment. Once I say that phrase, you can see why Rousseau, using language and talking about using language, would be an irresistible target for Derrida, given that his critique of philosophy is aimed squarely at traditions we associate with that intellectual movement and that concept. As our editors point out, Derrida thinks about writing as the ultimate instance of differentiation, that by its nature, writing stands apart from what it is supposed to be. This all stems from the disparity between the physical manifestation of writing and the notions that writing conveys. As Americans, we can think about a text like the U.S. Constitution and see his point. In one sense, it's just scribbles in black on an old piece of paper. In another sense, it's a schematic for who we intend to be. In another sense, it's a reflection on who we have been and how we got there. All of these different permutations suggested by Barthes and his exploration of what a text can be apply to it. But in and of itself, it is simply a material object and doesn't actually do anything until we invest it with our consciousness. Within this contradiction is the second contradiction of language itself, how words are not the things they name, and yet, at the same time, they are, and more than that. So for Derrida, truth does not exist in relation to the concepts of things in and of themselves, but in relation to the way they differ in the spaces between things. And we can go back to Plato again and his parable of the cave, with its suggestions that an ideal exists somewhere for every concept. So if you think chair, there is somewhere an ideal version of chair, and that is reflected everywhere in imperfect replicas when we sit down. For Derrida, the truth is not an abstracted ideal, but in the variation which exists between the applications of the concept, between one chair and another, and indeed between one chair and anything else. In the example of In Supplement, Derrida critiques Rousseau as the Enlightenment philosopher argues that the spoken word is an inherently more authentic version of language than writing, because writing is only used as a substitution for speech. Spoken words, in this view, have an innate value because of their proximity to the living mind generating them. The presence of the speaker makes a difference for Rousseau. In contrast to that, Rousseau thinks writing indicates the lack of presence, and it is therefore flawed. One might even go so far as to say it evokes the absence of speaker, perhaps acting as a metaphor for the mortality of that person. And what Derrida points out is that Rousseau's argument actually works to show why writing is superior, more potentially universal than the thing it supposedly imitates. The proof of this is rather self-evident, since today we only know Rousseau through his hated supplements to his own speech, him being in the grave for 240 years. Derrida, as it happens, really likes Rousseau, and he gives him some very sympathetic readings. Because of this, his exploration of difference through Rousseau takes on a kind of tragic air. To Derrida, Rousseau is brilliant, but this genius never turns his gaze on the assumptions which found his viewpoints, and so ultimately his brilliance is hobbled. The message to Derrida's readers might well be, don't feel bad. If Rousseau was thinking like an idiot, what chance did you have? Until now. So, I've enjoyed talking to you about these readings, but I'm sorry to say that these are the last ones for the course. I'll happily talk about them with you some more if you'd like. I'll leave that up to you. I'll post some further clarifications dealing with deconstruction during the week in my announcements. It's been a pleasure, and enjoy the rest of the course.